Hi, I'm Nate Kay, Systems Engineer with McNaughton-McKay, Central Ohio. In this demonstration, we're going to configure Optix as both an OPC UA server and an OPC UA client. To do this, we're going to create two Optix projects, configure one as the server, one as the client, and then connect them together. You'll notice in our Optix project that we created several analog and Boolean variables. In this example, they are just local variables, but we'll use our server to provide this information to our client. Let's configure our server. First, we'll browse our project, right-click on OPC UA, select New, and choose OPC UA Server. The first property to look at is our endpoint URL. You'll notice by default that it is set to localhost. This tells us that the OPC server will run on our local computer using port 59100. We'll leave this at the default setting. The next setting to look at is the maximum number of connections. This is the maximum number of OPC clients that will be permitted to connect to our server. The nodes configuration is where we specify what portion of our project we want to publish and what users have access to it. In this example, we'll publish our entire project and grant access to any user. To do this, I'm going to add and then click on Node 1, select its dynamic link, and point it to my root project, which is named Optix OPC Server. Next, I'm going to add a property called User1. When I click on its dynamic link, I get a drop-down box with a list of my current users. I'm going to select Anonymous, which will grant access to any user. My server is now configured. As the final step, I'll start the Optix runtime. You'll notice that I already created a screen with some gauges and checkboxes linked to my variables. This screen will allow us to change values to demonstrate that the OPC server is functioning. A couple of side notes. We left the security mode and security policy set to none. However, we could have changed the setting and enabled security. Doing so would have enforced security policies between the server and clients. Also, in our example, we're going to publish local variables to our client. However, one benefit of using OPC UA is that it is object-oriented and allows us to publish other objects found within our project. For example, in addition to variables, we can also publish PLC tags and objects like screens and graphics to our clients. Now we will configure the Optix OPC UA client. We'll start a second Optix project, which will connect to our Optix OPC server and subscribe to the variables published by that server. Our client will be able to not only view, but also modify these values in real time. We'll open our Optix project. We'll select OPC UA New and OPC UA Client. The first property to configure is the URL endpoint. This is where we tell the client how to connect to the server. Since the Optix server is already running locally on port 59100, we'll leave it at the default value. The portion of our URL called localhost is where we would enter the IP address of our Optix server. In most applications, the server and clients will run on different computers, and we would enter a different IP address, the IP address of our server computer. However, in this example, we're running both the server and client on the same computer, so we'll leave this as localhost. Since we're not using security, we'll leave the security policies as none. And that's it. Our client is now configured. Now we are going to have our Optix OPC client connect to our server, browse, and then import the variables that we created. To do this, we'll right-click on our client, we'll select New, and Tag Importer. Next, we'll right-click on our Tag Importer and select Edit. Now we'll click Online so that we can browse to find the local variables located on our Optix OPC server. We'll go ahead and select the tags that we want to import, and then we'll press Apply. These variables are still being hosted by our server, but our client will now be able to access them. Let's look at an example. In our client, we created a main window and added a couple of spin boxes and check boxes. We'll go ahead and drag and drop these variables onto the boxes to link them together on our client. And finally, once we complete adding our variables to the boxes, we'll go ahead and we'll start our client project. You can see that I now have two projects open. Our OPC server project on the right, where we created a screen to display and modify our variables, and the client project on the left, where we can display and modify the values of these variables as well. The variables are published by the server, but our client is subscribing to them. We can go ahead and modify these values on either the client or the server, and then watch them update in the other project. So we now have bi-directional communication between the server and the client. It's important to note that our OPC client doesn't have to be an Optix project. Any third-party device or software that can act as an OPC UA client can connect to our Optix OPC UA server. Likewise, Optix can connect as an OPC client to any OPC UA server. For example, I could use FactoryTalk Link's gateway as the OPC UA server, and then connect my Optix client to it. But that's it. We now have Optix running as an OPC server and client. Thank you for watching this presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to contact your local McNaughton-McKay representative or to visit us online.